thrilled that you are all here. My name is Lindsay Chervinsky, and I'm the Executive Director of the George Washington Presidential Library. I would like to thank the Ford Motor Company, who generously supports our monthly lecture series and makes these types of events possible, because we were able to bring in speakers and make it free to all of you. So thank you to them for supporting history and supporting our work. For tonight's program, you will see we are using our QR program, which allows you all to participate in the conversation. You always ask such excellent questions, and we would like you to feel as though you are a part of the discussion. So in case you haven't used the program before, you take out your phone and you pull up the camera app. You zoom in on the QR code, and it will take you to a website where you can enter your questions throughout the entire course of the conversation. I will then turn to them at the end, and they will be there waiting for me, and I'm looking forward to reading them. I'd love to tell you about a couple of upcoming programs we have at the library. On August 14th, we will be hosting a lunch at the library with Jamie L. Brummett, who will be discussing her book, Protestant Relics in Early America. And then 1 week from today, on August 19th, we will be hosting our next Ford Evening Book Talk with Kostya Kennedy on his book, The Ride, Paul Revere and the Night That Saved America. But we are here tonight to celebrate the 5 finalists of the George Washington Book Prize. So for those of you who are not fully aware of the history behind the prize, it is offered each year in conjunction by George Washington's Mount Vernon, along with our partners at Gilder Lehrman Institute of American History and Washington College in Maryland. The prize recognizes the past year's best works on the nation's founding era and is particularly focused on books that are designed to appeal and resonate with a broad public audience. If I may, just as a point of personal privilege, I first learned about this prize when I was a graduate student. And I thought it was the neatest thing I had heard of, because it was a prize that was supporting the type of work that really no other prize supports. It is not interested in being trendy. It is not interested in historiography, although those things are important. It is interested in supporting work that will appeal to as many people as possible and get them interested in history. And it has changed the scope of early American history because it demonstrates to authors that that type of work is respected and sought out. So getting to be a part of it now is just the coolest thing ever. The prize was first awarded in 2005, so we are on our 20th year, and it is one of the largest prizes in American history. The winner is awarded $50,000. We have a former winner in the audience too tonight, so that's very exciting as well. One final shout out to people that are watching online. Thank you so much for being here. I know that there's a watch party at the American Philosophical Society, so thank you all for participating as well. And now for our 5 esteemed finalists. Dr. Jane Calvert is the founding director and chief editor at the John Dickinson Writings Project. She is the foremost Dickinson scholar and has worked on him for over 2 decades. Her book, Penman of the Founding, a biography of John Dickinson, is an engaging and accessible volume that restores Dickinson's centrality to the American Revolutionary era. You will see I have my stack of props on the table, and all of the books will be available afterwards as well. Dr. Frank Cogliano is a professor of American history and dean for North America at the University of Edinburgh. He is an expert on the history of the American Revolution and the early United States. He is here for his book, A Revolutionary Friendship, Washington, Jefferson, and the American Republic. Dr. Michael Hattem is a historian of early America, specializing in the American Revolution and historical memory. He is the associate director of the Yale New Haven Teachers Institute. He is here for his book, The Memory of 76, The Revolution in American History. Dr. Cara Rogers Stevens is an associate professor of history at Ashland University, where she also co-directs the Ashbrook Scholar Program. Her book, Thomas Jefferson and the Fight Against Slavery, sweeps readers into the continuing controversy over the harsh contradictions between the ideals announced in America's founding era and the crime of African slavery. Dr. Tyson Reeder researches trans-imperial commercial networks, race, and revolution in the Atlantic, and he is currently an assistant professor at Brigham Young University. He was also formerly an editor at the papers of James Madison. He is here for his book, Serpent in Eden, Foreign Meddling and Partisan Politics in James Madison's America. He was also here last fall as part of our Founding Debates program when we looked at foreign meddling in elections from the founding to today. So we are delighted to have him back. Please join me with a round of applause for our 5 finalists. So if you were all keeping track as I was announcing those books, you will have noticed that we have an incredible breadth and depth of subject matter and material, and even types of professions in the history field, which just absolutely tickles me pink, because we have slavery, foreign policy, ideas and memory, friendship, political history, and biography, all combined on one stage, which is, I think, exactly as early American history should be. So, thank you all for doing your work. Thank you all for being here. It is a thrill to have you all in one conversation. I'm delighted. Let's maybe start with, can each of you introduce how you came upon the idea for your book, for your project, and what sparked you to write these stories? Oh, one disclaimer before I do that. Our audience loves a feisty conversation, so please feel free to interrupt each other. And me too, and jump in with ideas. We do not need to be formal, but for this one, let's start left to right.
Okay, thank you, Lindsay, and thank you everyone for coming. Can I begin just by saying how wonderful it is to share the stage with these wonderful scholars and their fine books? It's a great privilege to be here. My book began with a very simple premise. A student asked me a question. A student in my class on the American Revolution at the University of Edinburgh came up to me after class, and I think she was a fan of Hamilton, and she said, what was the relationship between Thomas Jefferson and George Washington like? And I gave what I think is the standard textbook answer. Well, I know it's the standard textbook answer because it's in my textbook. That, well, you know, they were kind of frenemies, and, you know, they disagreed over politics, and they represented two fundamentally different views of the future of the United States. So although they had a lot in common, they eventually ended up as opponents. And I went back to my office and I thought, I wonder if that's true. Of course, when you're answering a student question, you just have to be confident. So I answered with great confidence, but then I thought, I wonder if that's true. And I thought, well, surely there's a book on this. And it turned out there wasn't a book on it. And beginning with that question and that student's question, that's what led me to write the book. And I began at the beginning. This may seem obvious, but historians often don't. We begin thinking we know what happened and then finding the evidence. And so I read their correspondence. Jefferson and Washington knew each other for about 30 years, and I read their correspondence from start to finish. And I didn't read backwards from their estrangement at the end of Washington's life. And what became apparent to me is they had a long, fruitful relationship that grew into a friendship that was quite close before it all went to pieces at the end. So it began with a student question.
Jane.
I had, okay. I had one chapter in my dissertation on John Dickinson, and I was invited to a conference, and it was a small conference, and when folks were being introduced, the host said, well, so we have a John Dickinson expert in our midst, and I said, oh, good, I have a lot of questions, and so, you know, I'm like, you know, and then he introduced me, and I was, it was a mistake, but it showed really what the state of scholarship on Dickinson was, that a doctoral student with one chapter in her dissertation was an expert on him. And so I wrote my first book on his political thought, and then I saw that he had all these writings that needed to be published and, you know, collected and published, because he's the only major founder without a documentary edition of his writings. And so I was approached by the NEH to do that, and so I started doing that. And then I thought, well, I should probably write a biography. And I wasn't going to do that until I was much farther along with the writings project. We're only working on volume 5 right now. But the governor of Delaware asked me to write it sooner. And I said, I don't have time for that. I was a full-time faculty member, and I was the director of the writings project. And he said, you know, what would it take to get you out of those commitments? And I said, a lot of money. And the Delaware legislature graciously gave me $300,000 that went to hire a managing editor at the Writings Project, and bought course releases for me, and I sat down to write the biography, March 2020, when everything shut down. Yes, it was, I guess, if yours was a student question, mine was a mistaken introduction.
Jane, a historian asking for a lot of money is really audacious. I'm also grateful to be here with such esteemed colleagues. My project began back when I was still at the University of Virginia and an editor for the Papers of James Madison. And I was, while I was at the Papers of James Madison, an editor there, I was specifically assigned to work on his Secretary of State series because of my expertise in early American foreign relations. And I just started to find these nuggets. So this was in 2019. And so we were just entering the first Trump impeachment. And so, of course, there was a lot of discussion about foreign meddling. And, of course, we were in a era of really heightened partisanship in the United States. And I just started to find quote after quote from James Madison that seemed so relevant to the moment. But the one that sticks out to me the most and that really got me thinking about this project is he was writing a letter. The details aren't terribly important about what was going on, but he was really, really mad at the foreign minister for Spain who was in Washington, D.C. And so he's writing a 34-page diatribe against this guy. And he's sending it to the U.S. diplomat who's in Madrid. And he says, use this to bring all of our complaints about this diplomat in Washington, D.C. But among the many, many things that he said, that he complained about, he said, what would become of our democracy if we allowed, something to the effect of, if we allowed foreign agents to bias our elections? So it's 2019, and I looked at that and I thought, wow, you know, I've seen so many nuggets like this. You know, somebody needs to write a book about this. Oh, okay. So that's when I decided that it was time for me to start writing about that and turning a lot of my discombobulated thoughts into something that's hopefully coherent and useful.
Well, my project started because I needed a dissertation topic, and I had a really lovely advisor who said, well, nobody's written an intellectual biography of Thomas Jefferson's book, Notes on the State of Virginia. That's something new that you could potentially say about a man about whom there is not much left to say, it would seem. So that's the boring answer. The more interesting answer is, I think, that initially I'm not from America. I immigrated from a country called South Africa, and I was born when apartheid was still going on there. So I come from a regime in which the government imposed racial restrictions on everybody and cut off people's knowledge and ability to read and think freely. So America means a lot to me, and in particular, the Declaration of Independence means a lot to me. And so when I got to graduate school, I was really interested in the question of how could the guy who wrote that document have owned slaves? And so graduate school was my chance to try to answer that question for myself and make sense of, is America founded by hypocrites? Or is there more to the story? And is there something more redemptive? And this book is my answer. And if you read the book, you'll find out that I did indeed find that Thomas Jefferson, I think, was genuinely opposed to slavery and had a vision for a better future than the life that he was born into. So that's where my idea came from.
My book is the Memory of 76, and so it's sort of a history of how Americans have remembered the American Revolution basically since the 1790s down to almost the present. And the book's beginnings were also sort of around the Hamilton musical in 2015 when I was working on my dissertation. And I remember just seeing the Hamilton musical and seeing how much it reflected the present, right? And then when I went to look at what had been written on this topic, the last book that had tried to address the topic of how Americans remembered the revolution, certainly writ large, was from 1978, so around the bicentennial era. And what that book tried to do was to find the things that Americans had consensus about the American Revolution, what they agreed on. And of course, as a historian, being a product of my time, I was much more interested in finding the conflict and the conflicts that Americans have had and fights that they have had over the legacy and meaning of the revolution. And so I went looking for that, and that ended up becoming the first course that I taught after I got my first job teaching. And the book essentially grew out of that course, which sort of went chronologically through American history like my book does. And I also taught it again at another college, and it was a real eye-opener how teaching something that you're working on can really sort of, accelerate and add complexity to a project for a historian.
I love that you bring that up, because so often I think we look at books and we see the finished product, and we see, the arguments that have come to fruition, and so we kind of think that people just sit down with their ideas formed and write them out. And at least for me, I often develop my ideas speaking about them or actually writing them out. I sometimes get to my point through writing. So thank you so much for sharing how the process can really, thank you for all sharing how the process can elucidate the point sometimes halfway through. What I love about these books is that they are all not necessarily broad in scope in terms of people, but they cover time periods, and they cover change over time in a certain way. And so I'm wondering how you all think about when you're writing a story that covers a life as long as and as full as John Dickinson, or memory, how much that changes, or friendships that last for decades, et cetera, et cetera. How do you think about covering time and clarifying that change for people, and why it matters to cover a long period of time in a story?
So I'll take this, because this is discussed a lot in Madison circles, because Madison is often seen as somebody who kind of lived two lives, speaking of change over time. We get the dispassionate philosopher who fathered the Constitution, and then later the partisan who exacerbated partisanship in the United States and was the founder of one of the early parties in the United States. And so historians have struggled with Madison. What do we make of him? Do we have what's been called a Madison problem, where we get the Madison who seems to be advocating a strong national government during the Constitution era, and then we all of a sudden move to a Madison of the 1790s who jumps on board of Jeffersonianism and is advocating states' rights and is horror struck at what Hamilton seems to be doing with the national government. So this is discussed a lot, and historians have tried to understand, can we see a through line of consistency in James Madison? And they've come up with different answers. One that I'm partial to is that Madison was a consistent civil libertarian, we might call him. That he was consistently concerned with civil liberties, but found different answers about how to get there. So early in his career, he thought that the national government was a better protector of civil liberties, and that it was actually these small, homogenous states that were a greater threat to civil liberties of minorities and so forth. And so you expand the government, and the national government can actually protect those, can actually protect civil liberties better than states. And then he starts to see what Hamilton does with the federal government, and then especially once we get past Hamilton's time there and get to the Alien and Sedition Acts, he starts to really rethink that and say, well, maybe states are better protectors of civil liberties. So that's one explanation. But where I think I come down in my work in this book is that Madison always struggled between his partisan ideas and his constitutional philosophy. That's actually, I think, maybe a greater consistency, is that the contradiction was always a consistent through line in his life, that he was always trying to square those two things, essentially trying to get what he wants politically, and at the same time being true to some consistent philosophical values that he was fighting for. And those were always in tension with him throughout his life.
I can speak to this as well, I think. The challenge with Dickinson writing a biography was resisting the sort of magnetic draw to the moment of independence. Because if anybody knows anything about Dickinson, and most people don't know anything, they know that he did not vote on or sign the Declaration of Independence. And so, the temptation is to kind of rush to that moment and stay at that moment. And his only two biographers before me more or less rushed to that moment, dwelt on that moment, and then stopped. And so I wanted to make sure that he had this incredible life, and he had a full life and a full career well before independence. And so I wanted to make sure that I stayed in the 1750s and 60s long enough to give readers a sense of the man and the life that he was living, and his time in London at the Middle Temple for his legal training, and the marvelous letters he wrote home to his parents as and imagining him walking the streets and avoiding the sort of mire and the kind of truly horrible things that were in the London streets in the 1750s. And then showing how he developed his principles and tried to live his principles, and then put those principles into practice when he got back and took on clients and joined the legislature of two colonies. And then, of course, you have to spend time explaining independence. But then the challenge was that really, very little, almost nothing had been written on him after independence, and I didn't even really know that much about him because there were no secondary sources, and the papers, I'd collected images, but they hadn't been transcribed and certainly not annotated, and so trying to then dig in and show this incredible career that he had after independence as the president of two states and the chairman of the Annapolis Convention and the Federal Convention and the Delaware Constitutional Convention and then as a citizen activist and a philanthropist, and just going through, and so not defining his life on that one moment where he made a decision that he never regretted and he never looked back from. He owned it, but not letting subsequent historians sort of pigeonhole him and define him by that one decision. Sort of pulling the story apart and decentering it from that moment of independence. That's what I tried to do.
I think one of the great challenges we face as historians is we know, or we think we know, how things play out. People who live in the moment, the subjects we write about, don't know how the story ends. And reminding ourselves of that is a challenge, and trying to remember that is really, really important. And I think what Jane said about Dickinson is a case in point. I mean, we need to write their lives as they live them, or try to. And so in writing about Washington and Jefferson's relationship, I faced a question that was put to me a lot, especially by my wife. Why do we need this book? Surely we don't need another book about Washington or Jefferson, let alone Washington and Jefferson. My rejoinder to that, and you all need this book, is it works because it's about Washington and Jefferson, it's about their relationship. But again, seeing that relationship unfold over time and fighting the temptation to just go to the end when they become estranged. And then also with regard to change over time, Jefferson was very aware of this. He outlived Washington by nearly 27 years, and he spent those 27 years, or 26 and a half years, trying to get right with Washington and trying to influence, and Michael knows about this, how we would think about Washington and his relationship with Washington. So there was a sense of change over time there, but also recognizing, okay, he wants me to think this, but we can't necessarily be manipulated by that either. So we just have to respect the past and the lives of people. We don't know how our moment's going to end. We don't know what's happening to us tomorrow, and we have to respect that about our subjects.
So my book is fundamentally about change over time, but it brought with it a few challenges, and one is because there's so much time and there's so much change because the book covers 200 years. And one of the challenges with that is that I am fundamentally, or was fundamentally, an 18th century historian, and my book is really about the 19th and the 20th centuries. And so I had to come to grips with these time periods that I wasn't necessarily trained in. So that was one challenge. But another challenge was conceptual in the sense that when I was initially teaching the course that led to the book, you know, students would invariably get to a point where they would say, if the memory of the revolution has changed this many times, does it even matter, right? Like, if it can be all of these different things, if it can be, you know, something to Confederates and abolitionists, if it could be something to, you know, communists and anti-communists, does it really matter? And that question really got to the heart of the purpose of the book, which is, you know, seeing the revolution change over 200 years, how people remember it, seeing so many groups from across American life and across the political spectrum find meaning and value in the memory of the revolution, you know, just reinforced for me really the centrality of the memory of the revolution to our politics, to our culture, throughout American history. And so, you know, change over time, it proved to be challenging in many ways, but also quite clarifying in the end.
And I would just add, the fun thing about writing about the period that many of us are interested in is so much changed. The world was a completely different place before and after the lives of Washington and Jefferson. And they couldn't have known that they were opening this Pandora's box of democracy, but we do. And so that's a fun challenge, to try to contextualize for my readers what was the world like when this all started, and how did it change, and how did these people impact change over time. But then also writing about Jefferson in particular, people have always either really loved him or really hated him. And so it's a challenge to try to make sure that I'm not reading my own likes or dislikes onto him, but also to try to get into his mind to as much an extent as that's possible, and explain him as he saw himself, with the possibilities and the limitations that he was going through at the time. And that's fun as a historian. That's a fun thing to do.
Okay, so let's do some individual questions to dig into these excellent books. Tyson, let's start with you. So, as you said, in a lot of ways, this book was sparked by the obvious parallels that you were seeing in the news in 2019 and in Madison's papers. But maybe the methodology or even the mediums of foreign interference might have looked a little different. So what did foreign interference look like in Madison's day?
Foreign interference actually in some ways did look very similar. You do have, so for instance, if you're familiar with what was called the IRA, the Internet Research Agency, this was the Russian agency that was used to drum up disinformation campaigns and so forth during especially the 2016 election. You get something like that early on. It's happening in newspapers. The Spanish ambassador, the Spanish diplomat that I was referring to earlier, the Marquis de Caserujo, he is publishing anonymous, we'd call them op-eds, I guess, in newspapers at the time, just lambasting the Jefferson administration. And he's doing that to try to get Americans to think his way and to put political pressure on the Jefferson administration to do things that are favorable for Spain, because Spain and the United States are tussling over territory at this time, especially down in what is now the Florida Panhandle, which was West Florida at the time. So in some ways, there actually are the parallels can keep going deeper and deeper. But one thing that I think we've kind of alluded to in a couple instances here is that you can't think that history always looked the same all throughout, and that things and that just because history is playing out one way in our time means that was going to be the way it played out in an earlier age. So I when I talk about the importance of history, I say that there's two really fundamental ways that history can help us in our present moment. One is by finding the parallels, and I feel like I do that in this book, and sometimes the parallels just jump off the page and can't help but, you know, hit you over the head with a baseball bat. But then history should also kind of jog us, maybe even shock us out of the way of seeing our present moment, to say people didn't always think this way, and they didn't always have the same assumptions about the world that we do, and that can actually help us understand our present moment as well, by trying to kind of pulling ourselves away from our present moment. And so in that sense, in the book, when one of the reasons I wrote the book was because I saw a lot of people focusing on some of the parallels, but then drawing from those parallels the conclusion that clearly the founders were dead set against foreign meddling, and they everything they did was about trying to stop foreign meddling, and I actually came to a different conclusion in the book, which is that a lot of the founding generation didn't mind foreign meddling. It was the wrong kind of foreign meddling that they didn't like. When it was foreign meddling that was working for their politics, it wasn't so bad. When it was foreign meddling that was working against their politics, that's when they have a real problem with it. And so, you know, dealing with that, it's one of those books where everybody is a philosopher, and yet there are no angels in the book. That we see sometimes the better angels of our nature, as Lincoln might have said, come out of some of the actors, and sometimes out of the very same person we see the worst of their natures. Madison was everything that Madison did during the Constitutional Convention. In every major debate, he tried to account for whether the proposed provision would either repel or invite foreign meddling. He was a staunch opponent of foreign meddling. Okay, and yet by the end of the book, he's paying foreign agents $50,000 in that day's money. He could have bought a warship with that amount of money at that time. He's paying foreign agents $50,000 essentially to dig up dirt on his political opponents, the Federalists. The same person, right? And we see that with person after person.
Personally motivated politicians, you don't say. Okay, so Jane, when we're talking about Dickinson, you use this incredible analogy in the beginning, which I love because I think it explains so much how he thought about his principles, his ideology, and his motivations. And it's a nautical analogy, which is that of a trimmer. Can you explain what that is and how it helps us understand Dickinson?
Yes. So the trimmer is a nautical metaphor, and it could be used in two senses. On the one hand, it could be the person who trims the sails of a ship to go with the prevailing wind. So, of course, that's a political opportunist, and it's an insult to call someone a trimmer in that sense. But there's a trimmer in another sense. That is the person who moves the ballast of the ship in the hold in order to keep the ship afloat, to keep it from capsizing, from falling too far to the left or too far to the right, and keeping it on a straight and true course to its destiny. And so Dickinson was that kind of trimmer. This comes from, there was a pamphlet in the late 17th century called The Character of a Trimmer, and it was describing what we might call, a political moderate. I actually don't like that term for Dickinson, and I'll say why. But this trimmer, it has a great responsibility and a terrific duty to make sure that the ship of state stays afloat and on course. But it's a very difficult job, and whichever side gets the trimmer, the other side wants the trimmer. And so the trimmer is someone who sort of, the way the pamphleteer described it, there is no danger but from the beast called the trimmer. All the powder is spent on the trimmer. And so the person who tries to balance things is the one who gets the blowback. And that also happened to Dickinson. But so to this idea of political moderation, so Dickinson has been sort of called everything, radical, revolutionary, conservative, moderate, just sort of all over the place. I like to, I don't think moderate is really accurate. Well, let me start. All the left-right business doesn't really, you can't call him a liberal, you can't call him a conservative. Those words do not make sense in the 18th century. But you can kind of, take at some of the ideals. And Dickinson is not a liberal. That's maybe sort of too much of a secular idea. And he was very deeply motivated by his religious principles. He certainly wasn't a conservative. If the first conservative was Edmund Burke, and certain people are fond of saying, oh, well, Dickinson was the American Burke. Well, that doesn't make any sense. Edmund Burke's conservative credentials were made by his resistance to the French Revolution, and Dickinson was a supporter of the French Revolution. So that also makes it problematic to call him a moderate, because the French Revolution was not moderate. And Dickinson was also, he also fought. He was one of the few members of Congress who actually, when the Declaration of Independence was approved, he joined the battalion that he raised and marched to the New Jersey front to meet the British, and he was encamped, within half a mile or so from the British. And then he later, so he was a colonel, and then he later was the only one of the major or minor founders to actually enlist in the Delaware militia as a private. Gentlemen did not serve as privates, but he did. So that's, also sort of undermines the moderate label a little bit. But the way I think of Dickinson, he was a radical. He had radical political ideas, but he used moderate means. So process, he did not believe in violence unless it was in self-defense. And so he actually took the Quaker ideas of peaceful resistance and was the first American to bring these ideas to sort of America as a nation. He started describing and advocating civil disobedience in 1765. And before that, only Quakers had enacted civil disobedience. And we didn't really even get a name for civil disobedience until much later. And then, by the time later practitioners, Alice Paul, Martin Luther King, by the time they started engaging in civil disobedience, no one remembered that Dickinson had done so. But so he had, when I say radical ends, I mean that he was an abolitionist. He was the only one of the major founders to free all of his enslaved people during his lifetime. He advocated women's rights. He tried to write into the Articles of Confederation, which he wrote the first draft in 1776, and he wrote in not just women's protection for women's religious liberty, but also their freedom of public speech. He cared about sort of the least of us, making sure that veterans were cared for, that widows and orphans were cared for, that criminals were kept in decent prisons. He founded the first prison reform society, and so he was very staunch on these things. And let me just back up and go to the advocacy of the women's rights. That was rejected. In fact, the whole religious liberty clause that he wrote into the Articles of Confederation was rejected. But I submit, trying to advocate women's rights at the moment of independence was the most revolutionary move of the revolution. In fact, we all know, or most of us know, the story of Abigail Adams, asking her husband a couple months before independence to remember the ladies. And you know what happened? He laughed at her. He called her saucy and accused her of being like a disobedient child or an insolent Negro. And there Dickinson was trying to advocate the rights of his own wife, who was a Quaker. But he did these things with means that were not supposed to be disruptive. They were not supposed to be disunifying. They were not supposed to be violent. And that's the trimmer in a nutshell. And he paid the price for it. Not so much during his lifetime, but the historians who got a hold of him in the early 19th century, they are the ones who destroyed his legacy.
Those pesky historians.
What's that?
Those pesky historians.
Yeah, we're very dangerous.
The pen is more powerful than the sword. So, Frank, you talked about Thomas Jefferson and George Washington becoming actually close friends for a period of time, which I think is not how most of us associate them in our minds, because we think of them either early on when Washington was much closer to Hamilton during the war, or later on when Washington was much closer to Hamilton post-presidency. But they were buds. And so what did they talk about? What did they bond over? What was the nature of their friendship?
Agriculture. I mean, they were both
Foundation for all good relationships.
They were both Virginia planters, and they talked a lot about politics, but they spent a lot of time talking about agriculture. They both loved the theater. They had a number of common interests. I think one of the things that's most important about their relationship is, and Jefferson came to realize this after Washington's death, they agreed on the big things. So the important takeaways from the Revolution: the rule of law, the primacy of the Constitution, civilian control of the military, civil liberties, not unlike Madison, on those core issues. Now, I'm interested in what Jane had to say. On means they were different, and where they believed how these things could be guaranteed, they came to disagree profoundly. But on the kind of fundamental principles upon which the country was founded, they were in broad agreement till the very end. Politics got involved, personalities got involved, frankly, tempers got involved, and things were said in moments of high dudgeon that couldn't be unsaid. But I think upon reflection, and again, Jefferson had time to reflect that Washington didn't, he realized they agreed on the important things. So they talked a lot about those things. But I was really struck. There's a vignette in the book where it's when the government is in Philadelphia, and they were discussing how to respond to the French Revolution. And they went to see a mechanical thresher together. Washington writes to Jefferson and says, "Let's go see this mechanical thresher." And I'd love to have known what they discussed when they saw this new thresher. But the fact that they were doing things like this is really, really important. It's the stuff of friendship, which is you do things together. And it's not always the job.
Love that. Michael, one of the things I love about this book is that it's not just, that we have memories and that they change, but that they have a real purpose. And so you talk about the importance of a founding myth. What is our founding myth, and why is it important for nations and for people to have one?
Glad I got the easy question.
Well, in the book, in the introduction, I sort of argued that our memory of the Revolution, the popular memory of the Revolution, sort of writ large, is our sort of national origin myth, right? Our national origin myth serves the same purpose that many origin myths served for ancient societies and cultures, right? The origin myth, or the origin story, if you will, sets the tone. It sets the agenda, right? And so it's been really central to American politics and American culture for 250 years, because it is the origin moment, right? If we think about as a culture, we have a fascination with origin stories. You can see that in all of these superhero movies, prequels, right? People love prequels, right? we are sort of predisposed to be interested in those. But in the book, I talk about part of the power of the origin myth coming not just from the fact that it's the founding movement, but from the way that we tell the story of the American Revolution. And in the introduction, I talk about how the way that we have told this story, roughly matches up with a narrative structure called the hero's journey, right, which is identified by Joseph Campbell in the mid 20th century in his study of ancient hero myths. And so basically, what part of the power of this origin story comes from the fact that it's told in the form of a hero myth, right? And so that lends itself to all kinds of conceptions, not least American exceptionalism plays a great role in that. But again, because it is the beginning, it is the founding moment. It becomes central because if you can tie your political belief, your political agenda, whatever it is, your social belief or social agenda, if you can tie that back to the founding, that carries a significant weight and always has in our political culture, right? There's a reason that politicians walk around pulling out pocket constitutions or pocket declarations, right? And constantly referring back to the revolution, and it's because it has this power of legitimacy embedded in it because it is the origin story of the nation.
So, Cara, when most people think of Jefferson's notes on the state of Virginia, they think of it as the example of the worst of Jefferson and his worst rhetoric, his worst ideologies, some of his worst moments. And you argue in this book that we actually are really misunderstanding that, especially by sort of cherry picking certain passages. So how are you hoping to sort of challenge our interpretation of this publication, which has become famous in and of itself, and how does that change our thinking on Jefferson?
So two things. One is the story surrounding why Jefferson wrote that book and how he had intentions for it that changed over time. So Jefferson started writing his book, Notes on the State of Virginia, as an answer to a questionnaire. And typical Jefferson, he was one of the only people to answer this questionnaire sent out by the French government during the Revolution, asking different questions about the different states. I think 2 other states, in addition to Jefferson and Virginia, responded to this, and nobody took as much time and trouble as Jefferson. And then he turned it into a years-long project, doing all of this extra research, expanding the questions and rearranging the questions and making it into kind of a treatise on his own political thought and his love for his home state. But over time, Jefferson began to see that this could not only be something for the French diplomatic corps, but also that it could be of interest to European scientists who were the ones writing the story of the natural world and kind of passing judgment on the potential of different states and nations. And there was this perception that America was a flawed, kind of geographically backwards place, and that maybe even people who came to live here would degenerate over time because it's so damp and moist here, apparently, according to the French. And so Jefferson wrote to try to, I mean, it is pretty moist, let's be frank. Yeah. But Jefferson wrote to influence science, and so he started engaging more and more with European scientists to try to change the narrative. And that got him into some trouble because he started parroting European racial science, and it's not pretty and it's not accurate. It's a lot of prejudiced stuff. So that's absolutely what people now recall when they think of Notes on the State of Virginia. So he was doing that partly because he was trying to gain legitimacy with these other European scientists. And then over time, he also realized that he could change hearts and minds in Virginia with his words. That was his ultimate goal for the book, was that Americans, if they became better educated, would become more moral and would make better choices. And specifically, he thought if they could just become educated enough they would realize that slavery is immoral, and they would make the decision to vote to end slavery. And so he started writing with an eye to persuading prejudiced Virginians to free their own slaves by describing the negative impacts of slavery on the state. The other thing that I hope to contribute, though, is not just telling the story of who was Jefferson's intended audiences and how they changed over time, but I also got the privilege of being one of the first people to really work with the manuscript of Notes on the State of Virginia after it had been disassembled. So if you can believe it, Jefferson edited his manuscript by pasting pieces of paper on top of the original, and so the hundreds of words were obscured, and you'd have to actually look at the manuscript and like fold and unfold little extra addendums and pieces of paper, and then he'd scratched out and he'd written in the margins. And historians for many years worked with a microfilmed copy of this manuscript rather than the actual thing, which meant that they didn't have full access to the way that Jefferson had edited and the things that he had scratched out and what he had added and when he had added it. Finally, in 1997, the Massachusetts Historical Society undertook the work of disassembling this, and now it's digitized. You can go online, you can zoom in, you can pick up those little tabs of paper virtually and see exactly what he wrote. And there are ways of figuring out, based on paper quality, when he made different changes. And it turns out, after Jefferson wrote a lot of what he said about race, he sent it off to a friend, Charles Thompson, who was a fellow member of the American Philosophical Society, and asked for feedback. And Thompson wrote back and said, "Dude, I totally agree with everything that you're saying here about race. I think you're right. Yeah, there's probably inferior elements to the African race. But because I agree with you about that, and because some people might seem to take that as being a pro-slavery, I recommend that you get rid of that. Cut that whole section on race." And Jefferson didn't, which is a good letter to all of us about listening to your editors. He did not cut the entire section, but what he did do is he added lots of language to soften his conclusions. He added phrases like, it's a suspicion only. More research is needed. More evidence is needed. I don't know. The race science is not settled. We need to do more work on this. And here's how Africans are superior to white people in this way, and this way, and this way. He also doubled in length his anti-slavery chapter to really emphasize and bring home the point that he predicted disaster unless slavery was ended. To me, this makes a difference in how we read this document, knowing that Jefferson really intended for it to have an anti-slavery purpose. Now we read it and we're horrified at some of the things that he said, but from his perspective, he was trying to move slavery toward its end.
Well, thank you all so much. I'm excited to dive into these questions. They're excellent. So one that I would love for us to address from Bill Griffiths is, was there a unique feature of the era or of the founders' personalities and attributes that made the American Revolution a successful undertaking? And I would add an addendum, which is, if not those things, what do you think made it successful?
I assume you want us to be brief because we're running out of time.
Yeah, short answers, please.
I think the fact that they live on the periphery of a British-dominated space is incredibly important. So they have inherited a legacy, a revolutionary legacy going back to the 17th century from Britain. And there's your prequel, Michael. And they've reinterpreted that, and they believe, at least at the outset, and I think Dickinson's a good example of this, that they're seeking to preserve the British Constitution, and it's the British that have spoiled things through their innovations. So they're quite conservative in the start, but I think that's quite unique in terms of explaining why this happened. And I think, I say this as somebody who teaches in Britain and teaches this stuff in Britain, it's very difficult to persuade people that this is a British story. But it is a British story because it's the origin story for America. We see it as an American story, and we've lost sight of that. But I think, in answer to the question, that's one of the things that makes this moment successful and those founders successful, because of that cultural legacy.
To me, I think that's absolutely right. To me also, it's the age of ideas. These were men and women who were curious intellectuals, and they read, and they sought to devise theories that they could apply. They were scientists in that respect, but they really, really cared about ideas and principles. And oh boy, you know, we could use a little bit of that today. You know, just people who care about sort of thinking in the abstract and then, you know, trying to work out how to apply it. So I think there's like a certain type of person who's attracted to the 18th century for that reason, right? I mean, we all just sort of, we gravitate towards that. And so, but yeah, that for me, that's kind of what defines the era and the people.
Yeah, I'll echo that and go back to what Frank said about Jefferson and Washington, that there is some sort of fundamental sense that they are working toward the same end. To speak to what Michael writes, though, there was a lot of disagreement in between that they, gravitated toward also. So you can have people who have fierce disagreements, and in some ways, it is a time of what I would call political paranoia, when you don't just disagree with somebody about the direction of the country, but you assume that your political opponents are somehow fundamentally flawed or corrupt or something of the sort. And so it is a time of really profound disagreements. And yet there's also I think in at least the abstract, somewhere out there in these abstract ideas, they feel like they're working towards something that is common, and that there are common principles that they can draw on. And I'm going to dig at Dickinson here a little bit, and then you can come to his rescue, Jane. But I mean, things got really heated during the Constitutional Convention, and Madison at one point records, John Dickinson, who's going and representing Delaware, the small state of Delaware, at one point says, you know what, if the large states are going to insist on popular representation in both houses of government, you know what, we'd rather just break apart from the Union and maybe throw our lot in with the French or somebody. That we would, it's better to have a master across the sea than a master here at home, which would be the large states. And that's how fraught things got at the Constitutional Convention. Some of these were that idea was toyed with, and I don't know how serious he was or how much he was bluffing, but there was a lot of disagreement, and yet Madison ends up writing in the Federalist Papers that he couldn't help but see a finger of the Almighty in the Constitution, helping to secure the Constitution, because they actually came out of the room agreeing on something, and there was an end goal in mind that they could agree on, and to some degree put aside their major disagreements.
I think sometimes for a lot of people today, maybe younger people in particular, the 1790s, the early 1800s, the 1770s, the 1760s, they can feel very foreign, they can feel very distant, they can often feel inaccessible, and maybe even irrelevant. Obviously, we all don't think that. You're here, so this is a little bit of preaching to the choir, but for those unconvinced in the audience, or perhaps in the audience online, what is it about these stories and early American history that is still so important for us to know today?
We're going to celebrate the semi-quincentennial next year. It's the founding. I mean, this is where Michael's work is so important. It's the founding story and myth of the country. You can't understand the country without it.
Yeah, the thing about having a founding myth, an origin myth or a founding story, is that it is adaptable, right? If there's one thing my book shows, it's that. You can tell the story of the American Revolution in many, many ways, right? And even subtle changes to how you tell that story can have profound effects on the meaning that you're conveying, right? So, for example, changing the start date of the revolution from 1765 to 1775 has a significant impact on what you're trying to convey about the revolution. The same thing goes for if your end date is 1783 or 1789 or 1800, right? And so having this origin myth be so adaptable is important for us in the present, because my book should be a reminder that you can not that you can make the revolution anything you want it to be necessarily, almost, but not quite, but that you can make the revolution and by extension early American history, you can make it relevant to yourself and you can make it relevant to the present in many, many ways, right? And the memory of the revolution has spoken to generations of Americans, for over 200 years, and it still has that power. That power is, in some sense, inherent in the memory of the revolution because of its position as our sort of origin myth. So it's there to be used, is my point. And the 250th provides, an opportune moment to do that and to reflect on, what the meaning and the legacy of the revolution is to us as individuals and as American citizens.
And I would just add, used, but also, I hope, understood really well and learned from still. And I love what you said, Frank, that there are people in the revolutionary period who were able to be friends and really disagreed with one another, and then at the end of their lives, perhaps like John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, realized that they had more in common than what they thought, and that they had let their paranoia overwhelm them. And I hope that we today can learn a similar lesson when we're dealing with our own political enemies. I hope that people in the future are as charitable to us now as we historians need to try to be as we're trying to understand the past from 200 years ago as well.
I love that. So I have two final notes of business. One other thing that we can learn from this period is that the revolutionaries understood the power of the purse to get a message across. And so if you all believe in speaking with your dollars, supporting small businesses are a wonderful way to do that. And all of these lovely books are for sale outside. Little transition there to hopefully doing some business for these lovely authors, and our bookstore. Mount Vernon is a small business, and we very much appreciate your support for these books, for these authors. And supporting history more broadly. They will be happy to sign them for you and to answer any questions that we didn't quite get to. The second piece of business that I wanted to say is, so our finalists are selected by an independent scholars committee. And it is a real treat to both be able to be on stage with such excellent books and excellent scholars that also happen to be, hopefully, as you can see, decent and lovely humans. And so, I had nothing to do with picking that, but I'm very grateful that it is so. Yes. So thank you all again for attending tonight. We hope that we will see you again soon. For those of you online, we hope you will join us online or in person in the future. Please give them one more round of applause, and hopefully we'll see you outside.
Didn't want to say anything after what you said.